Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to walk through a very simple example of data engineering. I will demonstrate acquiring data from an online source. We'll explore that data a little bit and import that data into MySQL. Along the way I'll also talk a bit about data validation, which is something that really applies to the entire process. I encourage you to follow along with me, pause the video as you need to, and complete the same steps that I'm walking through in your copy of Workbench. We're going to use a data set that we'll download from the internet. There are many public data sets available, many sites that make data sets available for free use. And a data set is really some form of data that is collected based on many different topics and stored often in a CSV type file, or some other file formats are also available as well. They're made available for students and for researchers, and so it's a great opportunity to get familiar with how to work with data sort of in this form. Some of the sources available, there's sites called Kaggle, Data Hub. There are government websites that have data sets, NASA, the FBI, there's climate control types of sites out there, research sites, and there are just endless lists basically. If you're ever curious, you can always just go to Google and search free data sets, and you'll find many topics available out there. The data set we're going to consider in this example is one that is available on Data Hub, and it is in a CSV file format, which contains the price of gold every month since 1950. And there are only 2 attributes in this file, so the data engineering tasks will be very simple, but it's a great data set to start practicing with, downloading the data and working with it in MySQL. So I'm going to go to Data Hub. It's actually .io, not .com. And this is a pretty good example of an open source data set website. And if you're interested in development, there's tools here that help programmers access this data programmatically and everything else. But we're going to walk through these steps manually so you kind of get the idea of how this works. And so I'm going to use the Find Data menu option there. I'm just going to type, actually I'm just going to type prices, give you an idea. And each one of these things that you see listed here in the results is some form of pricing data set. And you notice there's like natural gas and house prices, all sorts of things. I'm going to go to the one that's labeled gold prices. And each of the individual data sets has a page where there's information about the data set. You see there's a graph here of what it would look like if you were to graph this data. As I said, this data goes all the way back to 1950. And then it lists the data files that are available, and you'll see you can download them here on the right-hand side. It gives you some sample data, so you see the format. And as I said, in this particular case, it's really quite simple. There's just a date and a price, and actually the date is only the year and the month. And then there's a couple of different formats of those. This one is annual. The one we're interested in is the monthly. I'll download that one in a minute. And then it also shows some other data sets that are kind of similar, right? So if you walk through this, you practice with this, you might want to try, doing the one with oil prices and natural gas, and some of those others that we saw, maybe housing prices, just to get some practice with this concept. And then there's some programmer information near the bottom about integrating, data set into programming languages and other tools. But I'm going to scroll back up to where the data files are located. Okay, and you notice that there's the annual set and the monthly set. I can also just download the entire thing. I'm just going to use this monthly data set, and I want the CSV version, which is right there, and I'll just click on it. It automatically downloads for me. It goes to my downloads folder, and now I have this data set here. And it's a CSV file. We've seen this file format before. I can actually just open this in any text editor. I happen to have Notepad++, for example. And you can see that the data is just, as I said, 2 attributes. There's the date and the price. If I go, down to the bottom, I can see I've got about 800 records, 850 records here, and this goes from almost current, here in July of 2020, all the way back to 1950. But since we're going to work in Workbench, I actually want to do most of what I'm going to do with this file directly here in our Workbench tool. So I'm going to start my instance, and one of the first things I'll do is I'll actually open that file here. And one of the things about this is that Workbench is intended to work with SQL scripts, so it doesn't necessarily know the contents or the type of data file that I'm looking for. So what I'm going to do is go to my downloads folder. You notice it doesn't show anything. I'm going to change the file type to all files. And now I can see that file we just downloaded. And if I just double click that, it'll open. Okay. All right, so that's that same data file. And when we start this process, there's a concept called EDA, which is exploratory data analysis. And sometimes it's just a simple matter of looking through the data a little bit to get an idea of what's here. Okay, as I said, we can see really quickly there's two attributes. We see there's a price and we see there's a date, but this is not a full date. And so if I look at this closely enough, I can say, oh, okay, I see that I have 1950, I have 1 year, and each month I have one entry. So that tells me I've got 12 entries per year, right? And if I scroll a little bit just to confirm that, looks like that's how this is laid out, right? There's 1955, same thing. So that tells me that really quickly the types of data and the structure of this. Okay, this is not, they're not giving me a price for every day. They're not giving me a price just for the annual, which is what that other option was on the Data Hub site. And so these are some really preliminary concepts about this data. So if I wanted to import this into a table so that I could start running queries against this, oftentimes what we do is we create just what's called a work table. And that work table might be just something temporary I'm going to work with, and then I'll toss it later. And but the bigger question is, what am I going to do with this data? Maybe I'm building an application that wants to look at gold prices and display that in some sort of visualization or a graph or something like that. Or if we think about this concept more generically, don't think about this as gold prices, but any of these data sets could be used in many different types of applications. So for our purposes, we just want to kind of work through the idea of creating a work table and seeing what we can do with this really simple data, just as an example. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new database. And I'm just using the graphic user interface for this. We could do this programmatically, of course, in a script file to create the database and tables. If I look at this, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a table using the GUI so that I can sort of point out a few things to think about. And again, we can do this programmatically. I'm just going to call this gold prices. This is our table name, right? And depending on what we're going to do with this data, I may want to create an auto increment ID. This is common practice in the industry, right? And it's always nice to be able to identify one individual row, and we may not need to do that, but it's a good practice. And we saw this in previous exercises as well. And then remember that we have a date and a price. And also keep in mind that this date is not a full date. This is just the year and the month. So I'm going to bring that in just as a string, and we'll actually manipulate that in a minute. So I'm going to bring that in as, let's just call it entry date. Sounds good. And I'm just going to leave it with varchar. I'm going to change this anyway a little later. And then the price, I'm going to make that, we notice that the prices are not huge, right? If I go back and I look, Back in 1950, it was $34. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, the biggest number looks like fairly small still, at least numerically, right, or data types. So if I make this a decimal of, we'll say 8 with 2 decimal places. So something to consider about this, we didn't, there's a lot of concepts and a lot of things about data types to learn and practice. If I create this as I'm showing here, decimal 82, means the entire width of my number in that field is 8 digits. And I'm asking for 2 decimal places. But remember, our data is going to come in with 3 decimal places. By making this choice, this is a data engineering choice. I'm accepting the fact that I'm going to lose, it's going to truncate that 3rd digit of the decimal. Okay, that's a decision I'm making. I could make this 8,3 if I really wanted to preserve that, but as far as monetary amounts, I'm going to get, like for example in this 286, right, it's going to do some rounding for me. I'm not concerned about that for this purpose. However, because the data is coming to me this way, if the full value is important, that's a data engineering decision that you make, right? And this is an example of data engineering. We're making some choices here. I'm choosing to bring that data in just as a string to start with, a varchar, and with the intent of I'm going to sort of manipulate that in a minute. And I'm making a choice about the price and the data type that I'm going to capture. And I'm aware of the fact that I'm going to lose this last digit, and I'm okay with that. In some applications, I may want to capture the whole thing. And these are examples, when we talk about data engineering, these are examples that I might make that decision myself if I'm the data engineer, or I might get that as instructions from the business, the customer, whomever I'm doing this for, who will tell me, I don't care about that 3rd digit, or, well, actually, no, I want to capture all of it, and we may need that later for, precision or something like that. So I'll create this table, and don't need that. And I don't really need that. Well, I'll leave it open for now. So now I have a table, but it's empty. There's nothing here, right? So if I go back to my query and I say, if I run that, it's empty, okay? So what I want to do now is I want to import that data from the CSV file into this new empty table. Okay? There's several ways to do this. Of course, again, it could be programmatic, but I'm walking through this using the graphic user interface, which is often more visual, and when you're first learning might be a little easier. And so you notice there's a button down here that says Import Records. When I open that, I'm going to browse and I'm going to go to that file, okay, that's in my Downloads folder. That's where it came in when I downloaded it. And I have to make a couple of choices in this dialog. I'm going to use an existing table, okay, and you also have the option of creating a table here, but we already did that, so that's fine. And I'm going to have this truncate table before import checked. And the reason that I'm going to do that is I may need to import this a couple of times. If I find some mistakes, if I find some problems with the data, I might need to go into the text file, the CSV file, and fix it there, and then re-import it. And I want to truncate that table before an import, just in case, right? Obviously, this first time, there's nothing there, so it really won't matter. But that's just something that I generally use to make sure that when I import this a second, a third, or fourth time, whatever I might need to do, that I'm getting just one set of that data and not get it duplicated. Click Next. And then this is where you line up, these are the columns in the source being the CSV file. And then these are the attributes that I created in my table. And you remember that I said entry date was going to be where that date is going to go, and then price. Okay, so you want to check to make sure that those are good. And it kind of gives you an idea of what it will look like. This little sample box as well. And then it confirms that. You say next. It will process that data. So while it's doing this, it's actually taking that CSV file, reading each row and parsing it, and then bringing it into my table. Finish. Now when I run this query, I see, if I look at my results down here, I have 847 rows. If I remember, this shows 848, but remember that we have one row at the top, which is the header that we don't obviously want in our table. So it gave me the rows that I was expecting. And so now I can do a few things. I can do some queries. I could write to do a little bit more exploration of this data. But the first thing I want to do actually is add a couple of attributes to split up this date, because I want to be able to run these just on year and just on month. Now I can do that and parse this, but because this is not a full date, I would have to parse that as strings. So let's just take a look at that. And this is an example of, again, this is a working table, right? So I can tinker around with this all I want, add attributes, play around with different data types, whatever I need to do to understand this data more, which is really what I'm trying to accomplish here. I'll call it GP year. And I'm going to actually change this to a character of only 4 places, and then GP month. And again, and as I said, that when you're working with these kinds of things, getting comfortable with the different data types, because there are many. I don't know if you've ever looked at this, but these are all data types that are available in MySQL. If you're using some other database engines such as Mongo or SQL Server or Oracle or anything like that, you may find others, but it's something that you get used to using. It's quite a long list, so trying to memorize them I think is fruitless. It's a matter of getting familiar with it and working with it over time. So I'm going to apply that change, and I can get rid of this. So now when I look at that query, I'm going to have 2 empty columns, right? I have these 2 columns that I just created. So what I want to do is I want to take what's in the entry date attribute and basically parse it, take it apart and save the year in its own column and the month in its own column. So I'll just use a standard update. And we will set the GP year. Substring is one of our functions in MySQL, and what do we call that? Entry date. And with substring, I want to take, here, let me grab one of these. Let's just look at how this works. Substring is an example of a function that, if you haven't worked with before, it looks at this entire set of characters as a string. And that first character is the first position, and then second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. Right? So I know that I have 7 characters. For this GP year, I want just the first 4. Okay? So the way substring works is I say, what field, what attribute do I want to parse or to get a substring out of? And where do I want to start? I want to start at the first character, I want to go to the 4th character. Okay? And then let's also do the GP month. And again, I want to do the same thing, use substring. This time it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 0 is in the 6th position, and I want to go to the 7th position. Right? And I don't need a where clause in this because I want this to be applied to the entire table. So in other words, every row is going to have that, the GP year and the GP month updated. So if I highlight that and run it, and then do my select again, now I can see that I have all the months and all of the, all the years and all the months parsed out. So now I can do some queries that are a little more sophisticated, I guess, and be able to see what types of things we might have here. For example, let's Let's try an average. Let's say the average price I'm going to go from our gold prices table. And let's just look at 1 year, because now that I have the years parsed, and remember that this is a character string, so I have to put the quotes around it, and let's just pick a year there. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. So for 1961, the average price for that year, based on the fact that we have 12 records, remember when we looked at the data, we have 12 records per year, right? So the average price for that year was $35.16. I could also expand on this idea. And you might wonder, well, why am I, creating these queries? I don't even know what this is going to be used for. This is one of the approaches that we use when we're doing our initial exploratory data analysis. We're just kind of getting an idea of what's available to us here. If I change this, what I want to see in this query is, it's the same query we used above, but I want to look at all the years, and I want to group by the year. So I'm going to take each year's 12 records and collapse those into one value, right, and to the average price. And I want to order this by that average price descending, which should give me the year that had the highest average price. Not surprisingly, it's 2020, right? But one of the things that's interesting, if we look at the results here, is we have 2020, which has the highest price, but it doesn't go, numerically by year. There's some years older, further back, 2012, 2011, 2013, that had higher average prices than 2019, right? And et cetera, et cetera. I'm curious if any of these, so you see down here, 1980's average price is actually higher than several years in the 2000s, right? So this is the beginnings, like the very, very beginnings of what's referred to as data analytics. Okay, and we're going to actually look at that a little later as well. But this is what data engineers do. This is a very simple example of acquiring data from some source. In this case, we pulled it, from the internet. But those sources, as we've talked about, can be many, many things. Websites from e-commerce vendors, from third-party vendors or sister companies, data coming from call centers, data coming from devices that generate data on a regular basis, log files from a server. It's kind of endless. And data engineers' tasks are to get that data. And this is, this example walks you through a very simple example of the types of things that they do. And then they take this information and they make this data available to whoever the appropriate people are, right? In this case, maybe it's some data analysts that want to look at trends of gold prices over time or whatever. And so there's many applications for even this simple data, right? We could graph this, we could take a look at what the trends might mean in relationship to maybe some historical things. If we're familiar with the stock market or housing prices, we might find relationships between all sorts of things, right? And so what I would recommend is that you walk through this, try some other queries with this, and also go back to Data Hub and take a look at some of those other data sets. Right. Remember that I said that, at the bottom of this page, so this is the gold prices data set. If I go down to the bottom of the page, there's other ones, like oil prices. Okay, well, what does oil prices data set look like? If I take a look at the samples, it's actually very similar, right? There's a date. Now, in this case, notice it's got the full date and price. So you could walk through these steps again and sort of practice with this concept. It takes a lot of practice and a significant amount of time to get really comfortable with this idea. And I encourage you to do that as much as it makes sense for you. And while you're doing that, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and thanks for listening.